Alrighty. Hey guys, it's Miss Mooney back at ya. So we are continuing on in chapter 14 for the Rocket Boys. This one is called The Pillar Explosion, and I hope you guys are enjoying the book so far. Now that I had received a letter from the great man himself, I felt almost as if I were already on Dr. von Braun's team. On February 1st, I heard on the radio that the Russians had launched Luna 1, the first man-made object ever to break away from Earth's gravity. The velocity required for that was 25,500 miles per hour, or approximately 7 miles per second. A distance I could visualize easily because 7 miles was the distance between Colwood and Welch. As the Russian spacecraft streaked toward the moon, I went up on the clubhouse roof to use Jake's telescope just to see what I could see. Jake didn't join me because he was going out on a date with Mr. Van Dyke's latest secretary, a redhead from Ohio. Although Mrs. Van Dyke had threatened to hire an ugly secretary for her mister, somehow another lovely from up north had appeared. Jake called up to me, "See any Russians on the moon, Sonny?" I poked my head over the edge of the roof and waved. "Not yet." "See any down there?" He threw back his head and howled at the moon just as the redhead appeared on the clubhouse porch, her spike heels clicking. Jake took her in his arms, twirled her around while cupping one of her breasts in his hand, giving me the grinning eye while he did it, and then guided her into his vet. He and the redhead sped with tires screeching toward an unspecified destination. I envied him and wished with all my heart that someday I would learn how to have Jake's confidence and devilish enjoyment of life. Deep down in my heart, and with considerable sadness, I suspected I never would. Born and bred West Virginians, it seemed to me, had a suspicion of anything that was too much fun, as if it were maybe a sin. I went back to the telescope and put my eye to the eyepiece. There was some speculation that the Russians' payload was a bucket of red paint. I spent the night on the roof alone, wrapped in my heavy wool coat, alternately dozing against the chimney and waking to look through the telescope. To my relief, no revolutionary red star appeared on the moon's yellow surface. The next day, the Welch Daily News said Luna 1 had missed the moon, but by a mere 3,728 miles. The next time they tried, the politicians and editorial writers worried the Russians might hit it, and then what kind of world would we live in? I worried with him. Would we never catch up to the Russians in space? Every time the United States launched a satellite, the Russians launched one bigger and better. I trusted that Wernher von Braun, at least, was doing something about it. In my own small way, I figured I was too. I hurried every day after school to my desk to pore over my rocket book. On the weekend, Quentin hitched a ride across the mountain to study the book for himself. All morning he sat on the side porch and carefully, reverently turned each page, his face a frown of concentration. I tried to sit with him, but there was so much I wanted to explain that I knew would be too much of a distraction. Chipper sat on Quentin's shoulder, his little black eyes following every turn of the page. His interest worried me more than a little. Chipper had, after all, eaten the family Bible in the winter before, chewed right through it from Genesis to Revelation, shredding generations of inscribed hickams in the process. So don't forget, Chipper is his mom's pet squirrel that she keeps in the house. Mom thought it was the cutest thing. All I knew was I found tooth marks on one page of my rocket book. I was going to declare hunting season on a certain bushy-tailed rodent. Mom fixed up some fried bologna sandwiches for lunch and called Quentin and me into the kitchen. Quentin continued to leaf through the book at the kitchen table. Finally he said, "There's a lot of theory in here that presumes the reader already knows subjects we haven't had. Chief among them, I suspect, thermodynamics and calculus. Did you note the discussion of isentropic and adiabatic flows?" I don't know what that is. You'll have to look it up or ask Mrs. DeLong. I'm sure she would love to talk with you about it. I slid my chair beside him. I had skipped over the chapter he was on, titled Elementary Gas Dynamics. I don't think anything in there will help us build a better rocket. I said. Actually, its pages of equations had discouraged me. Perhaps not, he replied coldly, looking down his nose at me as if surprised at my shallowness of purpose. But isn't it something you want to understand? All of these equations lead to a discussion of what happens to a gas when it enters a flow passage. He looked at me again. Sonny, a flow passage and a rocket nozzle are one and the same. I looked, perhaps blankly, because Quentin sighed and turned the page and looked at an illustration. Two trapezoids on their sides, the small ends facing one another. The figure was marked characteristics of flow passage for subsonic and supersonic flow expansion and compression. There it is, he said triumphantly. The answer to everything. Don't you see? I peered at the illustration. See what? Look, this is how a rocket nozzle works. Why it's designed as it is. Did you even bother to read about de Laval nozzles? I had at least done that. A Swedish engineer, Carl Gustav de Laval, had shown that by adding a divergent passage to a converging nozzle, one that was necked down to a narrow throat, the expansion of the fluid or gas coming out of the throat would be transformed into jet kinetic energy. In other words, the gas came out of the passage faster than it went in. I told Quentin my comprehension of it, and he nodded. Yes, you understand. Good. Then we should build. Quentin's face took on characteristic smugness. Perfectly calculated de Laval nozzles. We do that, Sonny, my boy. He reared back in the kitchen chair and waved his bologna sandwich. And we're going to fly rockets, not thousands of feet, but miles into the sky. He took a giant bite of his sandwich and chomped on it thoughtfully, lettuce hanging out the corner of his mouth. If we learn how to work these equations, I said. Quentin nodded. Yes, that will be the trick. I woke up to an earthquake in the night. My heart slamming against my chest. Dogs were barking up and down the valley. A battery of yips and yelps and howls. The telephone rang in Dad's room, and then I heard his feet hit the floor. He raced downstairs, and I heard the hollow thumping of the basement steps as he went down them. I looked outside and saw him heading up the path to the mine, struggling to his coat as he ran. He stopped once, coughed, and then kept going. The mine was lit up, big spotlights playing around the grounds, a gathering murmur of people in their yards talking across their fences, coalesced outside. Mom went downstairs, pulling her housecoat around her. Jim and I, putting coats on over our pajamas, followed her out into the yard. Mrs. Sherritts shared the news over the fence. A bump in the mine, a big one. That meant a pillar, or more than one, had exploded. I remember what Dad had told me that Sunday in the mine. The energy that was concentrated in pillars by the tons of rocks resting on them. But he had also told me that they were carefully engineered to hold the weight. And something had to be done wrong to make them explode. I pulled my mother to the side and told her what I knew. She looked at me sourly. Your father will take care of it, she said. But something's not right, I said. This shouldn't happen. She huffed, exasperated at having to talk about it. Sonny, I've been around coal miners all my life. What's supposed to happen and what does happen in them are two different things. You think Poppy was supposed to get his legs cut off. But Dad said if the calculations are done correctly, don't you think Werner von Braun does his calculations right too? She demanded. I still see his rockets blow up. Mom wrapped her housecoat tighter around herself and walked away from me. After a while, the dogs stopped their howling, subsiding to a series of whimpers, and everybody went back inside. The next morning and most of the days, Dad still didn't come home. But we knew, because the fence spread the word that no one was hurt, and that there was only one exploding pillar, and the gob far from the face. Dad had plunged inside the mine with the rescue team. They proudly called themselves the Smoke Eaters, and drove straight to the site of the pulverized pillar just in case there was anybody hurt. I found that out when Mom complained to him about it. I was in my lab and could hear them in the kitchen. It's not your job, Homer, she said. from the stepladder in front of her painting. I trained those men, Elsie. Then let them do what you trained them to do. You should stay back like Mr. Van Dyke. You just don't understand, Dad replied. Homer, she sighed, the one thing in this old world I do understand is you. The next Saturday, the day clear and cold with light winds, we set Ock B13 on the pad, sliding down the launch rod. A small group of people waited expectantly on the road. Basil sat on the hood of his Edsel. I was also surprised to see some sub-debs in their distinctive leather jackets standing apart. I went over to them when I saw Valentine Carmina, drop dead gorgeous in a tight black skirt and a white V-neck sweater. I just had to see your racket, Sonny, she said mischievously, taking me by my arm and whacking me away from the other girls. They were smoking and giving some boys who were yelling at them the finger. I can't take him anywhere, she sighed, looking at her company. I'm glad you came, Valentine, I said, feeling suddenly very warm. Her breast had pretty much swallowed my arm. She released me and turned me to study me. Sonny, I got something to say. I'm going to say it. I know you're crazy about that Dorothy Plunk, but she don't seem to give a flip about you. Boy, as cute as you shouldn't have to put up with that. She smiled and winked. You should have a girl who appreciates you. Now, I ain't saying who that girl ought to be, but you need to take a look around. Roy Lee walked up to us while I was trying to figure out what to say. My tongue seemed to be tied in knots. I hate to break this up. Believe me, I do, he said, but you've got a rocket to launch. He led me off, his hand firmly on my arm. Now there's a woman, he said. I worked to clear my head. Then I wondered if Roy Lee had been talking to Valentine. Before I could make an accusation, I heard Quentin whoop. He was downrange with one of the old mine telephones Odell and Roy Lee had acquired from the mule barn and for which, I remembered, we still owed Mr. Van Dyke. We were testing them for the first time. Sherman and Odell had run phone wires all morning, hooking them up to the old truck batteries donated by Emily Sue's father from his scrapyard. When I entered the blockhouse, the speaker to the phone squawked, startling me. God bless me. Blockhouse, Sherman said into the phone, and then listened. It works, he yelled. We each took our turn at the phone, talking to Quentin. You ready? I asked, all excitement. Ready. Stand by. I looked around the group. Roy Lee went outside and ran to BCMA flag up the pole. When he came back, I started to count, with Sherman on the phone to Quentin, keeping up with me. 10, 9, 8, 7. At 0, I touched the bare tips of the ignition wires to the battery. There was a spark as the wires touched, and then Ock 16 suddenly jumped. I said 13 earlier. It's 16. Pardon me. Suddenly jumped off the pad and flew straight up the rod into the sky, a white plume of rocket candy fire and smoke sizzling behind. It had a fine contrail, allowing us to track it all the way. When Ock 16 was just a pinpoint in the sky, it arced over smoothly and dropped down range. I heard a satisfactory thunk, and it hit the slack. We fired 3 more rockets that day. 2 2-footers and 1 3-footer, counting up to that would be 19. All performed flawlessly, flying nice elliptical trajectories downrange to impact on the slack. Billy aimed his theodolite, if you remember, that was the machine that they created that's going to measure how high they go, for a spot beside the blockhouse, and Quentin did the same with his downrange. 2 observation points made the trig more accurate, and Quentin calculated that the 2-footers reached an altitude of around 3,000 feet, the 3-footer around 2,000 feet, an observation that confirmed our suspicions on rocket performance and their size. When going for altitude, bigger wasn't always better. Basil stood beside us while we talked, taking notes. I heard the toot of a horn and saw the sub-debs leaving. Somebody was waving something pink out of the back window of their car. They were panties. I wondered why it is that females wear such creations. Quentin mused while the rest of the boys stared, open-mouthed. They seemed too slippery for good posture in the seat position. Shut up, Quentin, Royley said. I have also wondered why they wear stockings as a separate item. If they were combined with the panties, it would be more efficient. Shut up, Quentin, we all said as one. Basil laughed, but wrote it all down. When we returned from Cape Colwood for a BCMA meeting, Brother Jim contemplated us sourly from the sofa, where he was watching television. Will you sisters hold it down? He griped as we chattered out about our rockets. Quentin had a copy of the McDowell County Banner containing Basil's latest story about us. Jim snatched the paper from him, looked it over, and then threw it on the floor. Why would anybody want to write something on you jerks anyway? So you shoot off rockets. So what? People show jealousy in a lot of ways, Quentin snapped. In your case, Jim, old chap, it's overt. Jim turned to look at me. You better have your jerk friend take that back or I'll slug him. Quentin shoved his fist in the air and made little mixing motions. Come on, big boy, anytime. I could smash you with one hand tied behind my back, my brother said. Quentin barked out a laugh. And I could outsmart you with one brain tied behind mine. Jim reddened and came off the sofa. He pushed me out of the way, and he might have gotten Quentin if Royley had stepped in front. Royley was no match for my brother, but he gave me time to get up and wedge in beside him. Together, we might do Jim a little damage, if only accidental. Sister morons, he muttered, and went back to the sofa. Let's get out of here while we still can, I whispered to Royley and Sherman, and he, Sherman, Odell, Billy, and I shepherded Quentin, still sputtering, upstairs to my room. Chipper ran in past us and leapt up on the window curtain and hung there. I passed the rocket book around, inviting all the boys to inspect the pages of equations. To get all that we need to know from this book, I said, we're going to have to learn calculus and differential equations, Quentin added. Are you too crazy? Royley demanded. We can hardly do the homework they give us now. Nevertheless, Quentin said, it must be done. I want to learn calculus, Sherman said simply, and then Odell and Billy said they did too. Royley sighed. Here we are, a bunch of goddamn West Virginia hillbillies wanting to be Albert Einsteins. Werner von Braun's, I corrected him. Same thing, he said, but the way he said it, I knew he was with us. All right, and then you guys are to read the assigned reading for your class. Again, miss you guys so much. Keep reading, keep working hard. We are almost through this.